We're back again this week to study the book of Luke together. We're on chapter 2. We made it about part way through chapter 2 last time. And of course, the beginning of chapter 2 is the famed Christmas story. It's the one that, most of us particularly like to read. We have the shepherds and the angels and all this fun stuff. We love that aspect of Luke 2, and so we kind of looked at that story. We talked about the background, historical context of that. The biggest thing that we wanted to talk about was the overlordship of Rome at that time and why that mattered, and that influenced the census and things of that nature. And then we spent probably the bulk of our time talking about the story as it happened. We just read the story together, and then we focused on, the different characters involved, and particularly the characters we didn't quite know yet, which would be the shepherds who became the first evangelists, the ones who were told of the good news first. And they went immediately to tell everybody what had happened. We talked about the idea that their amazement, the people that they talk to's amazement doesn't necessarily mean a conversion experience, because they wouldn't have known all the details of what exactly it all meant. But they did understand the idea that this child had just changed the world. And so we read a little bit about that story as well. And then what we see after that is on the 8th day, which was Jewish custom, Mary and Joseph were in Jerusalem for the circumcision of Jesus, which would have been a pretty typical endeavor, but that's where we end up picking up our story here and starting in verse 25. Around the temple. And it's interesting because this motif that we see in Luke, and we saw it in the story of the birth of John, is there are a lot of mundane events that are turned miraculous. Do you remember what that was for John and for Zechariah? When Zechariah was in the temple, that would have been a fairly normal experience for Zechariah, a very normal experience for the people, and yet that mundane thing turned miraculous, and we see another mundane thing turn miraculous here. We read about the Holy Family going for the circumcision of Jesus. That would have been very normal, right? That wasn't anything spectacular. That was just what a Jewish family did. And yet out of that experience, we're going to see something miraculous happen here. And I think often that's the case. I think in today's world, we talk about how there aren't miracles that still happen today, and I think often we just miss stuff. We miss opportunities for the miraculous to happen right in front of us in the midst of the most mundane events. Think about who Jesus was. Jesus, by the world's point of view, would have been very mundane. No? Very mundane. Jesus was run-of-the-mill. Jesus was read average, right? Now, the story in Luke 2 tells us there's something else going on, but if you just run into Jesus later, people are like, why do people care about this guy so much? What's the big deal? He doesn't come from a wealthy family. He doesn't come from particularly royal lineage, and yet, of course, out of Jesus comes miracles. And so we see more examples of that here, and this is also just one more way that Jesus' story mirrors John's. But let's read, and we'll find out, what all that means. It says, "Now there was a man in Jerusalem called Simeon who was righteous and devout. He was waiting for the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Spirit was on him. It had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not die before he had seen the Lord's Messiah. Moved by the Spirit, he went into the temple courts. When the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him what the custom of the law required, circumcision, Simeon took him in his arms and praised God, saying, 'Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, you may now dismiss your servant in peace. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all nations, a light for revelation to the Gentiles, and the glory for all of your people Israel. The child's father and mother marveled at what was said about him. Then Simeon blessed them and said to Mary, his mother, this child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed, and a sword will pierce even your own soul. All right, let's go back and look at that again, and I'm going to slow down around some parts that I think we need to pay a lot of attention to here. Now there was a man in Jerusalem called Simeon, who was righteous and devout. We can take based on his location and based on the fact that he's receiving Jesus in the temple, that he is some sort of prophet, a religious leader here, right? He was waiting for the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Spirit was on him. It had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not die before he had seen the Lord's Messiah. So God had told him, you're going to see the Messiah before you die. We don't know how long Simeon knew this. We don't know if it says it had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit, if that was in this moment, or if it was sometime previously that Simeon was waiting. It seems to me, based on Simeon's reaction, that this is something he's been waiting on for a while, and something that the Holy Spirit had told him quite a bit of time ago. But the Holy Spirit revealed to him that he would not die before he had seen the Lord's Messiah. That's a little bit of foreshadowing. No? So who's the Lord's Messiah? Well, let's see the reaction. Moved by the Spirit, he went into the temple courts. When the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him what the custom of the law required, Simeon took him in his arms and praised God, saying, now whether they were explicitly taking the child to Simeon seems unclear. It doesn't appear as if that's the case, because it says he was moved by the Spirit. He went into the temple courts when the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him what the custom law required, not when they brought Jesus to see Simeon. But either way, it wouldn't have been uncommon for families to be coming in and out of the temple to perform the ceremony every 8 days, right? Probably. I mean, even more often than that, what I'm saying is that you circumcise on the 8th day. Babies are born all the time. So you're going to be having a lot of these happening, and yet Simeon is just in the temple worshiping, and he notices something different when Jesus and the Holy Family come in. And so he takes Jesus in his arms, and he says, Sovereign Lord. Sovereign Lord. Sovereign is not a word. You might have used the term Lord more casually in this language, but sovereign Lord would not be a word that would be used for any sort of master or headship or a term of respect. He would have just said Lord, not necessarily sovereign Lord. And he says, you may now dismiss your servant in peace. What do we think that means? It's pretty simple, right? I can die now. I can die now. Why? For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all nations, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of your people Israel. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But he says, I can die now because I've seen the Messiah for which you promised me. So immediately we can see the Messiah. You said that I could die. I wouldn't die until I saw the Messiah. And now I say I can die. What does that mean? This child that I'm now holding, this child that I'm witnessing, is the Lord's Messiah, right? For my eyes have seen your salvation. Talk about what that means a little more in a second too, which you have prepared in the sight of all nations, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of your people Israel. The child's father and mother marveled at what was said about him. You probably would too if that was your baby. Then Simeon blessed them and said to Mary his mother, this child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed, and a sword will pierce your own soul. Just from our own knowledge that we bring to the table, what Simeon says is true, right? Jesus causes the falling and rising of many in Israel, does he not? He causes the falling of many political leaders, of many religious leaders. Oftentimes those could be the same even. And he causes the rising of many of those people. If you want to call the rising of the oppressed because of the movement that Jesus installed upon his life, that can be part of this equation and conversation as well. You talk about the church, that's the rising of people in Israel. So we know that this is true. and that Jesus is a sign that will be spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed. The presence of Jesus revealed the hearts of people, did it not? We might dive into what I mean by that a little bit more in a second. And the sword will pierce your own soul too. So in this passage, Luke introduces this Simeon character who seems similar to Zechariah, right? He's devout and he's righteous, a faithful person who has some type of leadership in the temple. And clearly he lives by the leading and the direction of the Holy Spirit. That's what's orchestrating this whole situation. And so just like what happened with Zechariah, Luke establishes the credibility of Simeon. And Simeon responds in song here. But the credibility of Simeon is that he's righteous. The credibility of Simeon is that he's devout. The credibility of Simeon is that he has some type of leadership in the temple. But God had promised Simeon that he would see, let me go back. When I said Simeon responds in song, that's one more parallel to Zechariah, right? Zechariah responds to the movement of God through song. That's been a theme throughout the first 2.5 chapters here. God had promised Simeon that he would see the Messiah before his death. We mentioned that. But the movement of the Spirit here is what we can pay attention to. It wasn't just, I guess I'll just sit around and wait until I meet this Messiah and then I can move on with my life. It's at the prompting of the Spirit and being so filled with the Spirit that he feels called to move into the temple. It's simple to think that if this movement does not happen, if Simeon does not enter the temple, Simeon does not encounter the Holy Family. He's outside the temple courts. Oftentimes, outside the temple courts is going to be a very, very busy day, especially if we're waiting for the consolation of Israel. And so it's possible to think that the Holy Family comes in and out. Simeon does not encounter them. But he moves into the temple. And because he moves into the temple, he's able to encounter them there. And so that is why the Holy Spirit leads him there, because the Holy Spirit knows that the Holy Family is on their way. See, it's interesting that God is active in this situation through the religious ritual, right? God is active through the religious ritual that the Holy Family is following, through this very structured and organized religiosity. On the 8th day, you take your child to the temple, you circumcise your child. That is a religious movement in this story. But God is also active through the free guidance and free movement of the Holy Spirit. Are you with me? So it's the free movement of the Holy Spirit that moves Simeon to go into the temple. He's not going in there for necessarily any kind of religious ritual or sacrifice or offering or circumcision. He's there because God told me to in this moment. And I think it's interesting, one of the reasons that I like Methodism is that Methodism allows for both of these things that we see in this story to be active in the life of a Christian. It's not all ritual. Oftentimes, when a lot of these strikes that people feel against the Catholic Church and against the Lutheran Church is that it tends to be a little bit more ritualistic, and so sometimes that the freedom feels lost among people. I don't think that means the Holy Spirit can or doesn't move within those things. We're seeing it move right here. But oftentimes there's not room left for individual freedom of expression of the movement of the Spirit. And then on the other end of things, you have some fundamental denominations, and you have your Pentecostals who are on the other end of the spectrum where it is all freedom of the Holy Spirit. The religious ritual sort of begins and ends with having Sunday morning worship probably around the same time. But in those practices, it doesn't always end around the same time, like for Methodism, where we're like, 60 minutes and we're out. They have much more freedom of movement for the Spirit. So whatever the Spirit moves them to, oftentimes pastors don't prepare sermons. They say, the Holy Spirit's going to tell me what to say when I need to say it. So we see the other end of the spectrum. So that's freedom of the Holy Spirit over here. And then, of course, your Catholics, Lutherans, and then even Methodists to a certain degree, Episcopalians, are going to often operate based on electionary, which is a already provided schedule of when we work our way through the Holy Scriptures and what we teach and preach on to the other end of the spectrum, which is the Spirit's going to tell me what to do, when to do, and how to do it. And I like Methodism a lot because one of the reasons for that is because we find ourselves right smack dab in the middle of that scenario. We have a very organized structure of worship and organized expectations, and the way that we sort of do church affords for a lot of accountability. It affords for structure, but at the same time, we're founded upon freedom of the Spirit. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, had a similar experience to Simeon. He ended up at a church on Aldersgate Street in England, where it says that he felt his heart strangely warmed. He said he felt his heart strangely warm. This warmth came from the movement of the Holy Spirit in his heart that gave him the assurance of the faith that he held, the assurance of his sins forgiven, the assurance of what he was doing with his life, the assurance of what it was that he believed. And the Methodist Church, our roots come from revivals, and they come from camp revivals and things of that nature that would be unheard of in the Methodist Church today. We've actually become more and more and more increasingly probably structured over time, and I think now we're seeing that begin to loosen up a little bit here into the 20th and 21st century context of what we do things. But I think this is a great example to show us that God does operate within the restraints and within the guidelines of religious ritual, but God also operates outside of them through the freedom of the movement of the Holy Spirit. And so the moment that he encounters Jesus, the moment that Simeon encounters Jesus, he knows. His whole life, he is so in tune with the Holy Spirit that not only is it you will see the Messiah before you die, you might not know that you met him, but you're going to see him. No, he's so in tune with the Holy Spirit that when he encounters Jesus, he knows this is the moment that my life has led up to. And remember where they are, too. Remember where they are. They're in the temple. Do you remember talking about the temple? What is the temple? The temple is the dwelling place of God's presence. The temple is the dwelling place of God. Because undoubtedly Simeon, like I mentioned earlier, would have seen many kids, many babies, many 8-day-old babies and families come into the temple. But it's this time the Spirit tells him that this one is different. And it's more responses to the magnificent birth of Jesus. We talked a little bit about John in the magnificence of John the Baptist being about what he is going to do, right? What he's going to do eventually. John will do this and will be this. But look what happens here when Simeon sings about Jesus. For my eyes have seen your salvation. Present tense, salvation right now. Okay? Not what this child is going to do. We see that when he talks to Mary a little bit, but his marvel is not over what the child is going to do. His marvel is over simply who the child is. Right? And remember the context of Israel that we just talked about, how they're exiles in their own land because of the overlordship of Rome in their presence. And they believe that God is going to bring them through this, and through this Messiah, they will experience not only freedom from a spiritual standpoint, but from a more physical and political standpoint as well. And so in this song, we get a picture, the song from Simeon, we get a picture not just from someone in Israel celebrating like it was, with John as well, that it was, the small handful of people around him celebrated, but someone whom God has directed as to the majesty of this event. So God is speaking through Simeon about who this child is. We get a picture through this of who Jesus is and what Jesus means. And it's so incredible that even Joseph and Mary are amazed at what's being said. They've got the primer for all this. They heard from Gabriel. They saw the angelic chorus. They probably would have seen and heard from the shepherds. All of this over the course of the last few days, and yet when we see Jesus entering the temple, there's something remarkable happening there too. That what Simeon has to say is shocking and awe-inspiring even to Mary and Joseph. And I want to pay attention to the line that I just read a second ago right here. For my eyes have seen your salvation, Simeon says, Simeon more likely sung, when he's holding Jesus. My eyes have seen your salvation. It's salvation here, friends. Jesus is salvation. Jesus doesn't just bring it. Jesus isn't going to eventually one day bring about salvation. Jesus is salvation. Salvation is the presence of God. And here Jesus is God's presence, salvation, heaven among us. Heaven among us in the presence of Jesus. Because heaven is the presence of God. Salvation is the presence of God. Therefore, Jesus is those things. He doesn't just bring salvation. Jesus himself is salvation. He continues and says that he's a light to the Gentiles. Those that don't know Yahweh will know Yahweh because of Jesus. And not only does the light let us see, but it engulfs us entirely. It rids of darkness. It's not just a light bulb that goes on in their head and they see and understand, but everything becomes enlightened. It engulfs all of our being entirely, and all darkness is removed. Jesus offers that to the world around him. And Jesus offers glory for Israel, he says. For the anticipation and promise of Israel is fulfilled in this child. The glory of Israel from the beginning of time and the waiting upon this day has arrived, and it is for the glory of Israel. And then he continues when he sees that Mary and Joseph are amazed, and you can see that here in the middle of verse 34. The child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel. Not all are going to support this child, despite how miraculous he is. And and part of the reason they're not going to support him is because Jesus is going to reveal their hearts. How many times do we see that time and time again, for positive or negative, that Jesus reveals what is going on deep down inside of somebody? We see it with the Pharisees. We see it with the disciples. We see it with the sinners that Jesus interacts with. Jesus reveals the heart of people. And so because their heart has been revealed, some people are going to say, wow, that's incredible that Jesus offers me something different than what's happening deep inside of me. And some people end up resenting that, right? That Jesus reveals what's happening in their heart, and they try to cover it up, and they say he's a blasphemer. When really, Jesus just brings about the truth. And it says that Simeon says to Mary specifically that a sword will pierce your own soul as well. So the life of Jesus is going to affect you just as it affects everyone else around you. So here we go in this story, because we're going to get ready to move on now. Like the story of infant Jesus is over, and here in a couple of verses, we're going to kind of flip the page to young child Jesus, to about 12-year-old Jesus. But in these first 2 chapters, 1.5 chapters, we hear from Luke echoes of everything that Jesus is about. We see it from the very beginning, okay? Jesus is about piety. We see the piousness of the Holy Family in here. Jesus is about the inspiration of the Holy Spirit is at play within this as well. Jesus is about deliverance, delivering the people from their plight. Jesus is about joy and praise. We see that on multiple levels, don't we? People singing God's praises for who Jesus is. We see the idea of lordship and slavery in these passages as well. We see peace and salvation and universalism, and I don't necessarily, you don't read too much into that, but universalism in terms of this is for everybody, a light to the Gentiles and glory for Israel. We see social transposition as well. The movement from how the humble are uplifted and the proud are humbled. Jesus' purpose and mission is built up here just in the first 1.5 chapters of Luke. The most obvious of which to me is that Jesus is here for all. Jesus blesses Israel in a special way, but Jesus is here for anybody. Anybody remember the theme verse that we said Luke is? Luke 19:10, for the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. And yet, Simeon says that's going to face opposition, which of course we're going to see. So we'll continue on. We'll try to get to the end of baby Jesus here and then prepare ourselves to hear from kid Jesus here in a second. Continue on, verse 36. There was also a prophet, Anna, the daughter of Penuel of the tribe of Asher. She was very old. She had lived with her husband 7 years after her marriage and then was a widow until she was 84. She never left the temple but worshipped night and day, fasting and praying. Coming up to them at that very moment, she gave thanks to God and spoke about the child to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. So now we see another character of the same ilk, filled with the Spirit, a faithful listener, a devout follower of God. And what reaction does this person, this time a woman, have to Jesus? At that very moment, she gave thanks to God and spoke about the child to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Israel. If you want to look for the redemption of Israel, look no further than this baby that's in front of me, she says. This child is part of God's master plan for the entire world. See, Jesus, through these two stories, has already brought about salvation sheerly through his own presence. Jesus has already brought about redemption. Why? Because the presence of God is here. Jesus is not only praised and celebrated for what he will become, but perhaps most importantly for who Jesus already is. John was celebrated for what he one day will do. Jesus is celebrated for who Jesus is, which is what? Salvation. Heaven among us. And Jesus is celebrated for the things that he is going to one day eventually do. There's way more we could talk about with Anna. I think it's really interesting, but we just don't have time to, so we're just going to have to keep moving. When Joseph and Mary had done everything required by the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee to their own town of Nazareth, and the child grew and became strong. He was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was on him. We've seen the story before, right? Where we get to the end of the story of John and we move on to Jesus, and Luke sort of wraps it all up with a summary statement and implies the passing of time. But it's not just the passing of time here, is it? We don't cover much childhood of Jesus. We're going to see a story here in a second. But this is the end. This is the end of baby Jesus. This is the end of even young child Jesus. They had finished everything they were doing in the temple. Basically, he wants to make sure that we know that Joseph and Mary were faithful to the law, and once they were finished being faithful to the law and they were ready to return to Galilee, they went, and things are going the way that it's supposed to, which is the main point of this. Read verse 40 with me. And the child grew and became strong, and he was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was on him. It's not just the passing of time. It's not just turn the page, and now we find ourselves here. It's that things are progressing to the way that God had desired them to. And this tactic is used in other places in the New Testament. We said that Luke had already used it here earlier in his own writing. But it was used in the Old Testament as well. This method of saying time passes, things are continuing to progress as God instructed them to. So not just the passage of time, but the information that things are moving forward exactly how God needs them to. Okay? And that's where we're going to stop for today, since we're at a half an hour. We're going to go, and then this opens a whole can of worms here too, because this is a whole story. This next passage about Jesus and his family traveling for the Passover and all that kind of stuff. So I hope you'll join us. You'll join us for that. I look forward to it. We just don't have time to get into it today. It would take much more than just a couple minutes to cover. So we want to end it there. Hey, if you're still with us, I really appreciate you all being here. It means a great deal to us, whether you catch them live or you catch it sometime later. We're super thankful. We're super thankful for that. And we hope that this time together allows us to live out the gospel in a variety of ways. It's not just a head knowledge for us, but it moves into action. Remember, that was Simeon. It was the prompting of the Holy Spirit that moved Simeon to act. And because of that listening, Simeon was blessed. And so we hope that you'll find that as well too. And one of the ways that we find the Holy Spirit calling us to move is in assisting our community in a variety of things. And one of the ways that we do that this time of year is by providing families with the resources they need for their kiddos, for their schooling. It's crazy. It's already August. The summer seems like it's flown by. But we are heading in. We're prepared to provide over 100 students with the things that they need to succeed in the classroom this year, to make them feel seen, to make them feel heard. So you can go to our website and click the Give tab. You'll find an offering there that you can give online to that. You can also give here in person. If you go to our Facebook page, you'll be able to find the most needed supplies there as well. You can bring those to the church if that's something easier. You can get off Amazon and send them to us, whatever you'd prefer to do. We're thankful for that. We hope that that's a way that maybe you can take some of this and put it into action that others might know the presence of Jesus, that others might know salvation. And one of the ways that we can do that is by providing resources for them. So join us hand in hand for that. Thanks so much for joining us. I hope you stay